A servant carried a sack of bedding through the palace gate, and the guards let him pass. Why would they stop him? It was only linen, bound with a cord, slung over the shoulder of a merchant who came and went with the tradesmen. What none of them could know was that folded inside that sack, knees drawn to her chest, barely breathing in the dark, lay the Queen of Egypt. She was 21 years old. She had no crown on her head, no army she could reach, and a younger brother who had put a price on her life. Alexandria. An autumn night, 48 BC. Almost everything you think you know about this woman is probably wrong. Start with the face. Forget the one from the films, the painted eyes, the impossible beauty that has sold 1,000 posters. Look instead at her coins, the ones struck in her own lifetime, under her own authority. They show a woman with a sharp chin, a long neck, and a strong, hooked nose. Not a goddess. A ruler who wanted to look like a ruler. The historian Plutarch, who did more than anyone to turn her into legend, wrote plainly that her beauty on its own was not the kind that stops a man in the street. Her true power lay somewhere else entirely. And she was not Egyptian, not by blood. Her family, the Ptolemies, had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, but they were Macedonian Greeks, descended from one of Alexander the Great's generals who seized the country after Alexander died. For 3 centuries they had lived in Egypt and refused to become Egyptian. They spoke Greek. They married their own brothers and sisters to keep the bloodline pure. Most of them never bothered to learn the language of the people they ruled. Cleopatra was different. She was the first of her entire line to speak Egyptian, and she spoke far more than that. Her tongue, Plutarch said, was like an instrument of many strings, and she could turn it to whatever language she pleased. Greek, of course, and Egyptian, and the tongues of the Ethiopians, the Hebrews, the Arabs, the Syrians, the Medes, the Parthians. She could sit across from an envoy from any corner of the known world and answer him in his own words, without an interpreter leaning at her shoulder. She had been raised in Alexandria, in the shadow of the greatest library the ancient world ever built, a city that held more books and more brilliant minds than anywhere on earth. This was the weapon they would later try to erase from her story. Not her body, her education. Some months earlier, the eastern frontier of Egypt. Here is how far she had already fallen. When her father died in 51 BC, he left the throne to 2 of his children together, to Cleopatra, 18 years old, and to her brother Ptolemy, a boy of about 10. Sister and brother, queen and king, married to each other in the custom of their house, meant to rule side by side. But a child of 10 does not rule. The men around him do. And the men around Ptolemy, a scheming eunuch named Pothinus, a general named Achilles, a tutor named Theodotus, looked at the young queen with her sharp mind and her sharper will, and decided they would rather run the country through a boy they could bend. So they moved against her. They drove her out of Alexandria. And now, in the autumn of 48 BC, she sat at the edge of her own kingdom with a small army that could not break through, watching the throne slip away from her by the day. The kingdom itself was a wounded thing. Egypt was rich, the richest land on the sea, its fields along the Nile feeding grain to half the known world. But it was drowning in debt to Rome, and Rome was the giant now, the power that swallowed kingdoms and turned their kings into servants. Every ruler of Egypt for 2 generations had survived only by borrowing Roman money and buying Roman favor. To lose Rome's support was to lose everything. And then the giant walked into her city. His name was Gaius Julius Caesar. He was about 52 years old, and he had just done the impossible. Weeks before, on a plain in Greece called Pharsalus, he had crushed the army of Pompey the Great, his old ally turned rival, and made himself the master of the Roman world. Pompey had fled east, to Egypt, hoping the boy king's court would shelter him. He had helped their family once. He believed he was owed. He was wrong. As Pompey's boat touched the Egyptian shore, the boy king's men rowed out to greet him, and one of them drove a blade into his back. They cut off his head. When Caesar arrived days later, they brought it to him as a gift, expecting gratitude, expecting reward. Instead, the most powerful man in the world turned his face away and wept. Pompey had been his enemy, yes, but Pompey had also once been his son-in-law, a Roman consul, a great man. Seeing him reduced to a severed head held up by a scheming court, Caesar understood at once what kind of people ruled this country. He said, "So the story goes, that Egyptians were the last men on earth he would ever choose as advisors." He took over the royal palace with only a few thousand soldiers, the remnants of 2 battered legions, and he made a decision that trapped him. He announced that he, as Rome's representative, would settle the quarrel over the Egyptian throne. He summoned both the boy king and the exiled queen to come and be reconciled before him. The court seethed. The city, proud and Greek and unconquered, hated the sight of Roman soldiers in its streets. Caesar was a giant, but he was a giant standing alone in a hostile house, and everyone in Alexandria knew it. For Cleopatra, this was the whole game in a single throw. If she obeyed the summons and tried to enter the city openly, her brother's men would seize her at the gate or kill her on the road, long before she ever reached Caesar. But if she did nothing, Caesar would rule on the throne without her, and she would spend the rest of her life as a deposed exile, if she lived at all. There was only one path, and it was very close to madness. She had to get inside her own palace, past her brother's army, past guards who had orders to seize her on sight, and stand in front of Caesar before anyone knew she was there. The royal harbor. Dusk. She left her army behind. She took a single companion, a merchant named Apollodorus, a man from Sicily who was loyal to her and known to no one who mattered. As the light failed, the two of them slipped into a small boat, little more than a skiff, and pushed out onto the water. Alexandria's harbor was one of the busiest in the world, crowded with trading ships, and a single small boat among them drew no eyes. They rowed toward the palace as the last of the daylight died on the water. Then came the part that would echo for 2,000 years. To get through the palace itself, past the doors and the guards, she could not be seen. So Apollodorus took a long sack, the kind used to bundle up bedding for transport, and Cleopatra folded herself inside it, stretched out at full length in the dark. He tied the mouth of the sack with a cord, lifted it onto his shoulder, and carried her in through the gate. Here is where the legend and the truth part ways. For most of the last 2,000 years, people have pictured a carpet, a gorgeous woven rug that unrolls to reveal a jeweled seductress spilling out at Caesar's feet. That carpet does not exist in any ancient source. It was invented much later, and English translators flourish in the 1700s. Then seized by the stage and the movies because a rolled carpet looks better on a screen than a sack of laundry. The reality was plainer and far more daring. A queen sealed herself inside a bag of bedcloth and trusted her whole life to one man's shoulder and one man's nerve, gambling that a few minutes of conversation would be enough to change history. Inside the palace, that same night, the cord would think about what he saw. Not a vision from a painting. A young woman, dusty from the harbor, her hair pressed flat, appearing out of a bag in the middle of his guarded quarters through sheer audacity. Plutarch says Caesar was captivated at once, that she had shown herself a bold and daring thing, and that this alone began to work on him. Any envoy could send a letter. Any princess could beg through messengers. This one had packed herself into a sack and had herself carried through her enemy's army to reach him. Before she said a single word, she had already told him exactly who she was. And then she spoke. We do not know what she said. That is the strange, aching gap at the center of this whole story. The most consequential conversation of the ancient world happened behind a closed door, at night, with no scribe in the room and no record kept. But we know what she had to work with, and we know the result. And from those two things we can see the shape of it. She did not come to him weeping. She came to him with an argument. She knew Egypt's account books better than any man in that palace. She knew the grain, the harvests, the debts, the delicate balance of what Rome needed and what Egypt could give. She could lay it all out for him in his own kind of language, the cold arithmetic of power, and then turn in the same breath to Greek philosophy, to the history they both admired, to a wit that could keep pace with his own. Picture the shape of that argument. She would not have framed Egypt's debt to Rome as her weakness. She would have framed it as his opportunity. A stable Egypt, with her on the throne and grateful, could keep his legions fed for years, while a boy king run by frightened advisors could offer him nothing but the head of an old friend on a platter. She had seen how her brother's court greeted the master of Rome, and she let that memory do its quiet work, never naming it, simply letting him remember the platter. And somewhere in that night, she surely spoke of Alexander, the Macedonian who had founded her city and whose tomb still lay a short walk from where they sat. The one conqueror Caesar had wept before and longed to equal. She knew exactly which door in a great man's heart to knock upon. There was a sweetness in her voice, the ancient writers agree, a music in the way she spoke that made men lean in to listen. But the voice was only the instrument. The thing being played was a mind, quick and trained and utterly without fear. The mind of a woman who at 21 had already lost a throne and come back for it wrapped in a bedsheet. Caesar had spent his life among the most ambitious and dangerous people in Rome. He had never met anyone quite like her. By the time the lamps burned low, the giant had chosen his side. He would back the queen in the sack over the boy on the throne. Not because she was beautiful, because she was the most formidable person in the room. Dawn, the royal quarter. When the weeks that followed, Alexandria under siege. What she had won in a room, she now had to survive on the ground. The boy king's men would not accept it. Pothinus and the general Achilles marched the royal army into Alexandria, 20,000 men, and surrounded the palace quarter where Caesar and Cleopatra were trapped with only a few thousand of their own. The most powerful man in the world was now pinned into a corner of a burning city, and the underdog queen was pinned in there beside him. Their fates knotted together. The fighting tore through the streets and the harbor. To keep the enemy fleet from cutting him off, Caesar set fire to the ships in the docks, and the flames leapt to the shoreline and, by many accounts, devoured warehouses of books near the water, a wound to the great library that scholars still mourn. He seized the island lighthouse, the towering pharos that guided ships into the harbor to hold the sea lanes open. Inside the palace, the eunuch Pothinus was caught sending secret messages to the besiegers, and Caesar had him put to death. Cleopatra's own younger sister, Arsinoe, slipped out to the army, had the general Achilles killed, and took command herself with another eunuch at her side, a man who tried to choke the Romans by poisoning their wells with seawater. Caesar dug new wells through the night. Month after month, the giant and the underdog held their corner and waited. Late winter, 47 BC, the banks of the Nile. Rescue came overland. A loyal ally, Mithridates of Pergamon, marched an army down from the north, gathering strength as he came, and broke through toward the city. Caesar rode out to join him, and the two forces met the boy king's army on the banks of the Nile. This time there was no trick, only weight, and the Egyptian army broke. Ptolemy, the boy who had driven his sister into the desert, tried to flee across the water. His boat was swamped by the men scrambling aboard, and he went under, dragged down, the story says, by the weight of his own golden armor. He was never seen alive again. And Cleopatra, who had entered the palace folded inside a sack, was now the undisputed queen of Egypt. The years after, she had bet her life on a single conversation, and she had won the throne of the richest kingdom in the world. Within the year, she gave birth to a son and named him Ptolemy Caesar. The people of Alexandria, who missed nothing, called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. For a season, Caesar lingered in Egypt, and the two of them are said to have sailed up the Nile together, the master of Rome and the queen he had raised back to power, gliding past temples older than either of their peoples. But history does not hand out clean endings. 2 years later, in Rome, on the 15th of March, the men who feared Caesar's power cut him down on the Senate floor, and the woman who had won him lost her greatest protector in a single morning. She fled home to Egypt. She would find another Roman to bind her fortunes to, the soldier Mark Antony, and for a while it would hold, and then it would end in disaster on the sea at a place called Actium. In the summer of 30 BC, cornered at last by a colder, younger Roman who could not be charmed, Cleopatra chose her own death. She was 39 years old. Her son was hunted down and killed, and with them died the last Greek dynasty of Egypt and the whole long age that Alexander had begun 3 centuries before. And here is the cruelest turn of all. The mind that won her a kingdom is the very thing the world chose to forget. For 2,000 years she has been remembered as a face, a seductress, a body wrapped in a carpet, a beautiful trap. The men who wrote about her afterward, most of them Romans with every reason to shrink her, reduced the most educated woman of her age to the oldest and smallest story there is, a woman who conquered with her looks. But look again at the coins, at that strong, unbeautiful profile she chose to stamp on her own money. Listen again to what even her enemies admitted, that the real spell was in her voice and her words and the force of a mind they could not match. She did not seduce her way through history. She reasoned her way through it. What did she actually say that first night, in the lamplight, when the cord came loose and she stood up out of the dark? We will never know. Now, thank you for staying with this story all the way to its final, quiet moment. If this woman, the real one, the one behind the paint and the carpet, has reached you even a little, then stay here with us a while longer, and let us keep waking the pages of history that fell asleep long ago. Because there is always another story waiting just ahead, another night, another life, another secret that no one has told yet. Until we meet again.